In today's video, I'm going to show you why I upgraded from the Mavic Air to the Mavic Air 2. What's up everybody, welcome to Freely Roaming. So this is going to be the start of a new series that revolves around being a creator while traveling. In this video series, I'm going to talk about primarily photography, camera gear, drone gear, and just different ways to document your travels, either with photos or videos while you're on the road. In our other Mish channel, I've covered some photography, drone, and action camera equipment. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail in this one, primarily because I feel like being a creator while traveling is a really great way of building memories that you can look back on in the future. I've been flying drones for a long time. I've had 5 different drones since 2014 when I started with a DJI Phantom 2. Since then, I've owned 2 DJI Phantom 2s, a Phantom 4 Pro, a DJI Spark, a Mavic Air, and now, in this specific video, I'm going to talk about the Mavic Air 2 and why I upgraded to it. So this is the Mavic Air. I bought this 2 years ago, just before we came to Europe. This has been a great drone for the last 2 years. In fact, it still flies perfectly. I've got about 200 flights with this drone. And one of the reasons why I bought this one before we came to Europe is because of how small it is. The drone plus the controller is a really compact size. And in fact, I had the DJI Phantom 4 Pro, which has probably the best image quality in the consumer level drones that DJI sells. Still till this day, there hasn't been a replacement for DJI Phantom 4 Pro. And I also had the DJI Spark, which was arguably its smallest drone at the time, but the Mavic Air is actually smaller because the arms fold in. In the folded position, the Mavic Air is one of the smallest drones DJI sells. Today they sell a smaller one, which is the Mavic Mini, and it doesn't actually come close to the video and photo quality of the Mavic Air, even though this is 2 years older. So I've done about 200 flights with the Mavic Air. After a couple of years and roughly about 60 to 70 cycles for each of the 3 batteries that I have, the flight time has decreased noticeably. These batteries being kind of expensive, I started thinking about, well, maybe I should considering upgrading to a different drone. And lo and behold, the Mavic Air 2 just came out a couple of months ago. This right here is the Mavic Air 2. This is the successor to the Mavic Air original. And as you can tell, it's a slightly bigger drone in pretty much every dimension. It's slightly taller, slightly longer, and slightly wider. But practically speaking, it is actually not that much bigger, because the way you carry them is through these carrying cases. And as you can tell, this is actually the Mavic Air Original's carrying case, and this is the Mavic Air 2's carrying case. They're really, really close. This is a little bit heavier with all the gear inside, but this is a little bit larger. But all these differences aside, I'm going to tell you 5 main reasons why I decided to upgrade from the Mavic Air to the Mavic Air 2. The first reason that I decided to switch is because of its longer flight time. Compared to the Mavic Air 2 has almost double the flight time. The factory specification for the Mavic Air has a 21-minute flight time that'll take your battery practically down to 0, which I never do. So realistically, I was only able to get about 12 to 13 minutes of flight time each time, and that's with the battery low indicator at 30%. Comparably with the Mavic Air 2, I can get 22 minutes of flight time. So that's 10 minutes more than the Mavic Air 1. Even though most of the time when I fly, if I'm just trying to get a photo or a couple minutes worth of video to kind of weave into a YouTube video, I don't need to be flying for more than, let's just say like 5 to 10 minutes. However, what I found a lot of the times is that I may fly the drone up to do some exploring and find out that I want to shoot more video than I originally intended while I'm in the air. So the last thing you want to do is realize that you're running the battery down really low. And also when you run the battery down low, it's actually worse for the battery over time. So if I'm flying just 5 to 10 minutes on my Mavic Air 2, that only takes the battery down to about 60-65% of the battery life, which means that battery is going to last much longer. compared to running a Mavic Air battery down to 30%. After 60 or 70 cycles of the Mavic Air batteries, all three of them are starting to show a little bit signs of aging. That's why the longer flight time for the Mavic Air 2 just gives me so much more flexibility. The second reason is that the Mavic Air 2 has quieter propellers. Now these are the third generation of these folding propellers in the Mavic series. The original Mavic had these folding propellers just like these. They're probably slightly different in size, but design-wise they're very similar. Now the Mavic Air 1 has non-folding propellers, and as you can tell, they don't flare up on the edges like they do in the Mavic Air 2. The flaring serves a couple of purposes. It adds efficiency and it also makes the propellers quieter. Now when you talk about it being quieter, it's perhaps not actually lower dB in sound, but it is a lower pitch sound which draws less attention. For flying in areas where there may be other people, which is something I don't like doing, but from time to time you have to fly in places where there may be somebody at a distance or just a couple people near you, and you really never know how people feel about drones. A lot of people are intrigued by drones, but there are definitely people out there who do not like drones and do not like the idea that somebody's flying a drone around. So having these quieter or lower pitch propellers makes them a little bit more inconspicuous. So you can feel more comfortable flying these, even if there are just a couple of people around. There is one downside though. For one reason or another, DJI decided to change the way that these propellers are mounted on the motors. In the Mavic Air 1, there are counterclockwise and clockwise propellers that cannot be switched around. If you try to put a clockwise propeller on a counterclockwise propeller, they won't go in. But for some reason in the Mavic Air 2, you can actually put the wrong one on the opposite motor, which will be a really big problem if you try to fly with it. In fact, what will happen is the second you push up for it to go up in the air, it's just gonna flip around and crash. I don't know why they did that, but they did. So if you decide to buy a Mavic Air 2, just keep that in mind. The third reason is that the Mavic Air 2 has much longer range than the Mavic Air 1. The Mavic Air 2 uses what DJI calls the OcuSync 2 technology, which is different than the Mavic Air 1, which uses what they call enhanced Wi-Fi. The range difference is actually quite significant. You're gonna get about 2 to 3 times the range flying the Mavic Air 2 than you do the Mavic Air 1. Based on DJI specs, the Mavic Air 1 has a range of between 2 kilometers to 4 kilometers, depending on whether or not you're abiding by the FCC rules, which is in the US, or the CE rules, which is in Europe. It doesn't mean that you're actually gonna fly that far, but by having a stronger connection, which the Mavic Air 2 does, this will get you between 6 kilometers to 10 kilometers, depending on if you're in Europe or the US. This stronger connection means that you're going to be able to fly with more interference, and you're also going to be able to fly with more obstacles in between. Let's say you're flying in the mountains, there's some trees, maybe there's some obstacles like stones or rocks around. It's obviously going to be better if you have line of sight connection, but this is going to be a much stronger and more locked in connection, which is going to give you more confidence when you're flying. And also, because of the technological difference, the Mavic Air 2 and the Mavic Air 1 has about a 50% difference in the amount of latency you get. The Mavic Air 1 has a 240 millisecond latency, which means from when the camera on the drone sees the image to the display on your controller displaying the image, this is going to take about a quarter of a second delay for that to show up. Meanwhile, this is going to be half that. This is only going to be about an eighth of a second for you to be able to see that image. That may not sound like a lot, but that could be the difference between you crashing into something versus not. Okay, the fourth reason why I switched is actually something that people are sort of on the fence about. This is the controller for the Mavic Air. This is a pretty traditional controller that DJI has used for, I believe, starting with the original Mavic, and the DJI Spark had a similar controller, and then also the Mavic Air as well as the Mavic 2 Pro and Mavic 2 Zoom. They also use this style of controller. Now this controller, when it folds down, it's very compact, but the way that it works is that you open up these arms and then you sort of clamp your phone inside these arms, and you have to sort of figure out how wide it needs to open and which plug you have to plug in the controller and kind of sandwich the phone in here. And then you have the screen below the control, which is a pretty good design, and the fact that it lets you fold it down to a small compact size is really nice, but it isn't as ergonomic as the new Mavic Air 2 controller, which is this one. As you can tell, it's a lot bigger, and some people don't like it because of that. I wanted to actually try this in my own hands before I made a decision on what I thought of them. And after having this for a couple of weeks, I've flown my Mavic Air 2 about 6 times now. I actually really like it. I love the ergonomics. It's got this kind of soft rubber backing here, so it gives you really good grip. And the way that the phone clamps on is different. You have this phone holder that pops up, and it has this kind of spring-loaded mechanism, so you can clamp a pretty large phone in here, and it holds it securely in place. And the wire now comes out the side and just plugs in without you having to clamp something else around it. So I feel much more solid with this controller in hand while flying. And now, after flying it for about half a dozen times, I feel like using the sticks down here and looking up at the screen is a much more pleasurable flying experience. And better than that, this has a much larger built-in battery now. So in the past, when your controller is plugged into your phone needs to have its own battery for it to work, because the smaller battery in this controller won't charge your phone when it's in place. But this one will actually charge your phone. If you've flown DJI drones for any amount of time, you will know that there's been time where you realize that your phone is really low on battery, and when you plug it in, you need to have your phone basically to be able to fly. Now, I think it's possible that you can fly long enough sight without seeing a phone or without having a phone plugged in. I've never tried it, but I wouldn't recommend doing that, just because you're gonna feel a lot more confident knowing what the camera is seeing. So now I know that the phone can be charged while this is plugged in. It makes me feel a lot better about not having to do as much pre-planning, making sure my phone is charged before I fly. And if I see something that I want to get the drone up there to capture, I can do that as long as I know that the controller is charged. And another new thing that I didn't think would matter that much, but I actually really like, instead of just having these hardware toggles for sport mode and normal mode, now I have sport mode, normal mode, and also tripod mode. Tripod mode is when you want to really slow the drone down and get a really precise image, or if you're trying to fly through kind of a small space and you want the drone to kind of react slower to your controls. So you can kind of go into tripod mode and have the drone pan at a slower pace, or fly forwards, backwards, up and down, left and right at a much slower pace as well. Instead of having to go into the menu to select that, you can now just select that directly on the controller itself. I think that's really nice. Okay, the final main reason why I upgraded to the Mavic Air 2 is the new camera. So it technically is a bigger camera sensor, but it's not bigger by much. The 2 has what they call a 1/2-inch sensor, and the Mavic Air original has a 1/2.3-inch sensor. So what that means is that the diagonal distance from corner to corner on this one is 1/2 inch, but 1/2.3 on this one is actually really close. It's a 0.43 diagonal inch sensor. So the dimension of this sensor on the previous version is 63 millimeters across and 47 millimeters down, whereas the new one is 64 millimeters across and 48 millimeters down. So it's actually just 1 millimeter wider and 1 millimeter taller. So it's not actually that much bigger of a sensor, even though it sounds like it on paper. But what is impressive is the technology that's in this camera. This camera has what's called the quad Bayer technology. So what this technology allows you to do is for this camera to split one sensor into 4 different parts. And instead of a 12 megapixel picture, this will have a 48 megapixel mode that'll let you take a photo in much more detail. It's not exactly the same as a 48 megapixel photo. It has its limitations, but because of the technology of the quad Bayer sensor, this will effectively give you much more resolution and allow you to crop in more if you needed to. It also now has an HDR video mode, which in the past, the Mavic Air only had HDR photo mode. The Mavic Air 2 is also the second only consumer drone that DJI makes that has 4K 60 frames per second. Not even the Mavic 2 Pro has 4K 60. So this, in some aspects, is actually better than the Mavic 2 Pro, which is the flagship of the Mavic lineup. Compared to the Mavic Air 1, which has a limit of 100 megabits for the 4K 30 video bitrate, the Mavic Air 2 upped it to 120 megabits. To most people, it's probably not going to be noticeable, but you're going to be able to do more with color grading, be able to crop in, and be able to manipulate the video files compared to before. So those are the 5 main reasons why I switched to the Mavic Air 2. And for those of you guys that stuck around to the end, I'm going to give you 3 bonus reasons why you might consider switching as well. The Mavic Air 2 has what's called APAS 3.0. APAS stands for Advanced Pilot Assistance Systems. And this is their 3rd version of this system, which basically is DJI's intelligent obstacle avoidance system, meaning that it's using the sensors in the front, on the bottom, and in the back to avoid obstacles as it flies. With APAS 3.0 turned on, you're going to be able to avoid obstacles without your intervention. I've not done a lot of testing with APAS 3.0 yet personally, so I will report back to you guys after I fly some more. Second bonus reason, I really like that in normal mode, this now flies 50% faster compared to the original Mavic Air. The original Mavic Air in normal mode flies at about 18 miles per hour in its maximum speed. That feels kind of slow, honestly, when I'm flying. It doesn't give you that quite nimble feeling as you're flying. You always want it to go faster, so what you do is flip it over to sports mode. Now with this one, it flies at 27 miles an hour. Both of these have a 42 mile per hour top speed in sport mode, so that doesn't really have any advantages. But because this can fly 50% faster in normal mode, I don't feel the need as much to switch over to sport mode, which means that I can fly and potentially save the battery even longer. On top of this, having already nearly twice the flight time as the original Mavic Air. And lastly, for the 3 bonus reasons, DJI has a new app that's called DJI Fly app. Now, the previous drones that I've owned have used what's called the DJI Go app, and the latest version is the DJI Go 4. What DJI has tried to do in the past is to try to cram as many features as they can into a single app, and also use the single app to operate as many different versions of their drones as possible. They ran into a wall with the DJI Go original version and had to switch to a DJI Go 4. It felt at the end that the drone was really heavy and bulky, and it just didn't feel like that it was as efficient anymore. With the DJI Mavic Mini, which they came out at the beginning of this year, they switched to the DJI Fly app, which is the new version of what they're probably going to be moving to going forward. So the Mavic Air 2 also used the DJI Fly app. I like it because it feels lighter, it feels more modern, the UI is simpler, easier to navigate. The downside is that it doesn't have as many features, which arguably it's the reason why it feels snappier and faster, but depending on how the architecture of the software goes, I hope they're going to be able to keep it fast and snappy while they add more features over time. So those are the 5 main reasons and 3 bonus reasons why I switched from the Mavic Air to the Mavic Air 2. If any of you are considering buying the Mavic Air 2, I would highly recommend buying the Fly More combo. The Fly More combo, just in the 2 extra batteries alone and the ND filter, is well worth the price. If you're going to be traveling and going on adventures and don't want to worry about batteries dying, with only 1 battery with the standard package, there will be a time on your adventures where you're seeing an amazing capture that you're missing because your battery is not charged up. So at the very least, buy some extra batteries. So in conclusion, I think the Mavic Air 2 is DJI's drone that has the best size, quality, and price compromise of all the drones that they have for somebody who travels. The Fly More combo comes in at $999, a little bit more if you're buying outside of the US, but not that much. If you would have asked me back in 2014 when I bought my first Phantom 2 that in 6 years the technology would come this far, I would not have believed you. A lot of people fly drones today, and people are used to seeing drone videos and drone photos everywhere, but there's still just that sense of awe when you're seeing something that you're normally unable to see with your own eyes. So that's my first video for this new creator series. I will be uploading more videos that talks about mirrorless cameras, microphones, lights, drones, action cameras, tripods, and just all the gear that I use to capture moments when we're on the road. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss those videos that are coming up soon. And also, if you like this video, I appreciate a thumbs up below. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.